Painting Value, Building Blocks of Digital Art. Hi everyone, this is Hardy from Digital Painting Studio, and today we're going to go over the most powerful fundamental concept in digital painting, which is value. I'm going to go over the basic concepts, show you how we apply these ideas, like actually how to physically make marks with your stylus to get good, controlled results, and finally we're going to put everything together into a really cool digital painting. So if you've never made a digital painting before, perhaps you have some traditional art skills and you're considering making the jump to digital art, or even if you are a total newcomer to art in general, you'll find this really valuable. So, what is value? Basically, it is just light and dark. Does something have a light value towards white or a dark value towards black? We can plot this scale numerically to make sense of it, but it's basically just this grayscale spectrum that we can use to create the illusion of three dimensions when painting on a flat surface. Let's take a closer look at this sphere rendering so that I can show you what I mean. Now, this is about the simplest three-dimensional object that we could possibly render, but it's very believable. It looks very round, very three-dimensional, just because of the correct application of value. Now, we can use this to kind of identify a few main parts of every value rendering. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, we have this bright highlight. That is the spot where the light source is most directly illuminating our three-dimensional object. Moving over into the dark, we have this core shadow. It's kind of where the light falls off, where the light's no longer really hitting the object. So it's kind of what curves away from the highlight, away from the light source. Now once we get past the core shadow, we have a reflected light. That's this lighter area where light is sort of bouncing off of some other nearby surface. So if we look at this circle in section and we kind of imagine the rays of light illuminating this object, this all starts to make sense. The light most directly hits the highlight area, and then it sort of falls off to make our core shadow, that darker area. And then we just have light sort of scattering in from other places to make that bounced light. So if we look at this in terms of this sectional view, that all starts to really make sense. And if you can keep this concept in mind, even more complicated objects like a human face, it all follows the same rules. The planes of the face, the surfaces pointing towards the light source, are lighter. The planes of face that start to curve away, those become our core shadow. And then of course we have that bounced light and reflected light coming from other surfaces. So if you can master this core concept, really render this three-dimensional sphere well, and understand these different parts of value that we're using, you can apply this concept to any object. It's a really powerful tool for a digital artist to have. Now, let me show you how we go about making value, how we actually apply this concept to digital painting. So I've got a basic Photoshop document set up here, and all I've done is I have set up a simple gray background so that we can see our value being applied. A few quick words on the brush I'll be using before I get started. I'm using this Photoshop default chalk brush. I'm just doing this to add a little bit of texture and interest to what we're doing, but you can use a simple circle. Any brush will work for this. It's just something I'm doing to make it a slightly more interesting textured look, but don't worry about that at all. In my brush settings, I have pin pressure set to size jitter so that if I press lightly on the stylus, it will give me a very thin mark, but if I use more pressure, the mark gets wider. So it gives us this nice thin to thick variation. It makes our brush strokes look much more natural. It just gives a lot more expressiveness and a natural feel to our painting. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the key to using value well is control. You want to be able to put the right value in the right spot. You want it to do what you want it to do. Now, the way I do that is I set flow and opacity very low. I like this to build up slowly. I want to have a lot of control, and I never want values to just come firing out of the stylus without me knowing what's going to happen. So setting your flow and opacity very low is a great way to give yourself a lot of control. And the way I do this is I just tap the stylus and start to build up tones. Let me show you. So with flow and opacity set low, I just tap once and it gives me kind of a light mark, not much there. But if I tap twice next to it, it's slightly more light. And if I keep going with 3 and then 4 it keeps getting lighter and lighter and so on. So that's how we build up tones. That's how we go from not much light being added to a very bright highlight being added, is just by tapping over and over again. So each time the tone gets brighter, that's another tap of the stylus. I'm tapping to build up tone. Okay, so now that we have some basic mark making skills, let's put this into practice with a really simple value exercise. So the first thing I'm going to do is fill in a circle shape, and I've just used the marquee tool, and I have filled that in by hitting Command Delete. That kind of fills in your background color. I'm also going to make a cube shape, so I've switched to the polygon lasso tool that gives me these easy straight lines, and I'm making this diamond shape. I'm kind of trying to think three-dimensionally. That's going to be a cube with different surfaces facing light and dark. And just the same thing, I'm going to fill that in again with that keyboard shortcut. And now we've got a nice base silhouette layer. So anytime I command click on that layer, that selection comes back. You see the little dotted lines? That means that anytime we paint, it only paints within that selection. So that's a really handy way to make sure that none of your value marks go outside of these shapes. It keeps everything very nice and neat. So just like before, we're going to switch to our chalk brush, and I'm just going to start laying in some basic values, thinking about my light source, thinking about my highlight, my core shadow, and my reflected light. So I've got flow and opacity set very low, and now it's time to just start laying in some basic marks. And I've created a new layer for this. Now I just start by tapping in once and then twice and then building up tones so that it's sort of faint out towards the edges and it gets brighter the more I want that highlight to be intense. So it's just like our basic mark making exercise where we're just slowly building up tone. I have complete control over where these brightest marks are going. And just like that, with just a few taps of the stylus, it already looks pretty round because that light is fading from brightest to darkest. It gives us that rounding out effect that value gives us. It's that great illusion of three dimensions. Now if I do the same thing but a little bit lighter, it gives us that nice bounced light, that reflected light coming from the ground. And that really helps complete the illusion of three dimensions. We've got a pretty believably round three-dimensional looking shape here with just a few marks, so already you can see the really incredible power of value. Now with renderings like this, I like to save my brightest bright, that pure white, for a little accent highlight. So to bring up white and black, you just hit D on the keyboard. It brings up those default colors. So if you hit D, it brings your background and foreground color to black and white. Now if you hit X, it reverses those, so you can kind of toggle back and forth between white and black. So if you ever need white, you simply just hit D and then X to switch to white. So that's all I did there, a very handy keyboard shortcut. But just to do that again, now I have white ready to paint, and I'll just add in one more little round of value rendering here just to add a little highlight, something really to give it some pop and shine and just really complete the whole illusion of three dimensions. And I'll just kind of feather that out a little bit by rendering out some midtone. So we have a really nice kind of range of values. We go from that core shadow all the way to this nice accent highlight. To add a little more polish, I'm going to use my smudge tool, and this is another just Photoshop default brush that I'm using, but it adds a cool little accent to our value rendering. We're kind of smearing around tones just to give a little more texture and interest. And if we follow the curve of our spherical shape, it can make this even more convincing. We're sort of smudging around in curves to make it almost seem like we can see the surface details on this object. Really starts to look realistic, like it's made of stone or some kind of marble or metal or something cool. So lots of interesting little accent information can be added in really easily with just a little bit of polish using this smudge tool. In fact, when I'm painting a value painting, I very often switch from the brush tool to the smudge tool back and forth. The keyboard shortcuts are B and R, and I find myself pressing those two keys very often, kind of jumping back and forth. So let's apply some of the same ideas over here to this cube. So I've command clicked on that silhouette layer, and using the lasso tool, I'm sort of removing the shapes that I don't want so that I can only paint on this facade that's sort of facing directly at the light source. And again, just building up those values slowly I'm adding some tones to that light source side. Similar process to select another facade on this cube, and I'll add a slightly darker side, as if that's the side that the bounced light was getting to. Same thing on this bottom surface, and just like that we have a pretty convincing cube. I hope you're starting to really see the power of value and how it can create realistic illusions of 3 dimensions. So it's time to put everything that we've learned so far into practice and create a digital painting. So for our subject, we are going to be painting this apple. Now you can just screen grab this, or I've got this available for download at digitalpaintingstudio.com. But you can really choose anything. This is a good simple object because it's mainly spherical. It has a very good sense of highlight, core shadow, and reflected light, just like our sphere exercise. And it's a really great object, especially for beginners. But if you want to take your own photo, definitely feel free to do so. So I've got a basic Photoshop document set up here, and I've pasted in this apple photo, and we're just going to leave that in this corner here to use as a reference. We're going to copy both the shape and then later the values to start using this as our 3-dimensional object reference. So that's on its own layer. Next, I'm going to create a new layer that we're going to do our sketch on. So I'll just rename this Sketch. And guys, this is my basic process for creating even really complex digital paintings. So this formula can be expanded to all kinds of amazing things that I'd love to show you in later courses. But for now, let's stick to this very simple object. I've got my brush tool selected, and it's just a default round brush. It's the very simplest brush that Photoshop offers, and that's really all that we need to do a simple sketch like this. I'm going to reduce the opacity of my sketch layer down to about 100%. You can do that either with this slider bar, or there's some cool keyboard shortcuts for that. If you just hit the number keys, it adjusts the opacity by factors of 10. So 1 is 10, 2 is 20, etc. So an easy way to change the opacity of your layer. So I think this is working for us. I'm going to make my brush very small just to simulate kind of a pencil tip. And I'm keeping one eye on the apple reference in the corner and the other eye on my canvas. And we're just going to start sketching out this basic shape, sort of an oblong sphere, essentially. It's got some cool little lumps on it that make it look a little more interesting than just a simple sphere, but essentially that's what we're going for. So some nice smooth lines, using my erase tool just to smooth out some of those stray marks I've made. Then I'm going to put a little indication of that little indentation at the top of the apple that kind of shows all the little lines that are on the apple's skin kind of pinching into this one point. So I'm going to transform this now. I want to make it a little bigger. I just hit Command T to transform this layer, and as you can see, we can modify all kinds of scale and sizes. But if you hit Control, you can switch to all other kinds of modifiers, and I've selected Warp. Really like this one. It divides it into 9 sections, gives you a ton of control over all the little adjustments that you can make to the shape. And I noticed that right side had a really smooth arc on the reference photo, so I wanted to change that just a little bit, and I think that's better. You can see kind of a nice before and after that really changes the whole shape of it. Just hitting Command Z to undo. And up next, let's do a little more fine tuning. I've hit Command Shift X, which brings up this super cool liquefy function. And as you can see, guys, with this, you can use a big brush or shrink it to a smaller brush to do all these really fine adjustments to the line. This is the artist's best friend. You can fine-tune anything in a project. Even if you get to the very end and there's something not quite right about it, liquefy can save the day, make everything just right. So I think that's close enough. It doesn't really matter if we copy it perfectly. This is just a nice exercise. So next we're going to use this line drawing to block this shape in. And what I've done is select the magic wand tool and select the outside of this shape. So out in this white space on the exterior, I go to Select and Inverse, or Command Shift I, and now it's switched to the inside. So now I have a selection that fits that sketch perfectly, and what I'm going to do is fill that in on a new layer. So with my Medicine Dropper tool, I've grabbed that dark value on the reference photo, and I'll hit Option Delete, and that's how we fill it in, just like that. Option Delete fills in the foreground color. So I'm going to make a copy of my sketch layer just as a safety net, and then I'm going to merge the sketch and this new blocked in silhouette that we've created. So I can see the indication of that indentation, but I've also got it so faint that it won't really get in the way of our value painting. I'm going to darken the background to match the reference photo a little bit more, but mostly to give us a good base to do our value painting. I'm using the smudge tool just to sort of brush out a few rough edges on that perimeter. I've renamed my silhouette layer, and guys, we're ready to start adding some value. So before I start adding tones, I'm going to switch to this chalk brush. This one gives it a really nice painterly feel. You can see the settings here, but this is one of the brushes that is available for download. Any brush practically works for this, even that default round. But if we command click the silhouette layer, it gives us a selection, so we can paint within this apple shape with no fear of going outside the line. So always inside the lines when you've got that selection made. Even though you don't see the marching ants right now, I just hit Command H to hide them, but we are selected here. So I've started adding in some values. Notice I'm sampling them from that reference photo. When you have your brush tool selected, all you have to do is hit Option and it turns to the medicine dropper tool. Unbelievably time-saving shortcut there. You can always just grab values from anywhere on the page and just kind of pick them up and lay them down, all with the brush tool and the press of a key. So remember, we build up our values from dark to light with the number of times that we tap. So these areas that are higher in value, I've tapped that light color more times. So we sort of build it up on that value scale that we talked about earlier in this course. That's how we get these lights on the light planes and the darks on the dark planes. Now remembering the elements that we need to have in every three-dimensional value painting, right now we're already developing a nice highlight, mid-tone, core shadow, and I'm even starting to do a little bit of reflected light bounce there on the bottom. So again, using the medicine dropper tool to select that highlight, we have that really nice shiny bright highlight right there on the lightest part of the apple. That really gives us a ton of information about the apple's skin. All those little bumps, the sort of irregular shape of the highlight really lets us know what the skin feels like. Gives it a lot of texture information, really starts to make it feel real. And guys, that's really the funnest part of this whole process, is when these marks on the screen start transforming into something believable. Now I'm working in this transition area where light turns to dark, and notice there are a lot of little splotchy marks both on the painting and on the reference photo. This is called the mid-tone, and there's a ton of information there. We want that to be very visually active. There are all kinds of little bumps that are creating shadows and highlight planes, so you want that mid-tone to be really visually active like we see here. Gives it a ton of realism. I'm going to put a nice hard value edge. I want a light edge to shine against that dark on this indentation area. We're going to have a ton of information. Now I'm switching to my smudge tool. We'll start refining things a little bit. This tool is a ton of fun to use. We're just sort of pulling all of these little tones around the page. And as you can see, it really starts making things look really polished and realistic, especially with all these little striations and lines on the apple's skin. We can really pull those linear shapes around with this smudge tool, and it starts making it look super realistic. It's a lot of fun to do. Sort of smooths things out, gives things a little more polish. I tend to jump from the brush tool to the smudge tool really often in my own paintings, and I definitely recommend that technique. A ton of fun and a great way to get a really polished look without a whole lot of effort. So I'm going to do a little bit more of that refinement down here in the core shadow area. Again, want that mid-tone area to have some nice visual activity, and that's looking really nice. So really at this point we're just starting to refine things. I think our values are pretty faithful to the reference photo, and it's certainly looking three-dimensional and pretty realistic. So I'm going to start adding in a little bit of background information. So I'm using the gradient tool, and I'm going to switch it to this mode, which applies the gradient in both directions. See that? It's kind of a good way to establish a horizon line. Smooth gradients going up and down equally. So this is a pretty brightly lit floor, so I want that to be pretty bright. So next we need a core shadow, and I'm going to select our marquee tool, switch it to the elliptical marquee, and we're just going to pull out a very broad ellipse, roughly in the shape of this reference photo shadow. And again, I filled that in with Option Delete. I'm going to run a few filters on this to make it look a little more realistic. The motion blur kind of blurs the outer edges, sort of drags it sideways. And then a Gaussian blur, which just universally makes it a little more fuzzy. The next thing we're going to do is add a layer mask. And with a gradient, I'm just going to mask away a little bit so that the shadow becomes less intense the farther away it gets from where the apple contacts the floor. So next, I've grouped everything and created a copy of the group so that I can merge my apple into one layer. This makes it easier to adjust. So we can't adjust all those layers individually, we want them to be merged together. And I'm doing a little bit more transforming and warping, just like we did to the sketch. And it's looking pretty accurate to that reference photo. I'm smudging the outer edges very lightly with the smudge tool just to give it a little bit of a blur. Those sharp edges can really make a three-dimensional object seem flat, so a good final polish step. But that's basically it, guys. You've now created your first digital painting. We've sketched in our rough forms, used Photoshop tools to refine and transform things as needed, and then we used everything we've learned about value to make a convincingly three-dimensional rendering of our reference object. Be sure to save this first painting so that you can compare as your skills increase. I hope you found this helpful and even inspiring. The possibilities with digital art are endless, and this is just the very tip of the iceberg. For detailed tutorials on how to design and paint just about anything, be sure to check out digitalpaintingstudio.com. Get inspired, level up your skills, even launch a career. I have loads of amazing resources for students who really want to get good. I hope to see you next time on Paint Cool Stuff, and in the meantime, take care and good luck with your artwork.